So my guests today are James Kourtides of the Rooster's Crow podcast and my usual partner in crime, Sherry Cedar. Today we're talking about meditations on the tarot, but this is not the next installment of our series, which we will record later. But we're going to backtrack and we're going to take another look at the chapter 4, letter 4 on the Emperor. Because James has also been reading the text and has some interesting insights. And so we wanted to have another conversation about that because I think it's a particularly deep and meaningful chapter, and I think it has a lot to say, particularly to our times. So I thought it was worth having another conversation about that. And then while James and I were kind of bantering back and forth about, what to include in the conversation, we may end up touching a little bit on some of the insights of Saint Sophrony and Sergei Bulgakov as well, because they also have things to say about politics from an Orthodox Christian perspective. And we can see maybe where they might differ from what Tomberg has to say about the idea of authority in the letter on the Emperor and where they would align. So if anyone wants to get it kicked off with an initial thought or observation, go for it.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on. I appreciate it. It's a lot of different things came to mind this second and third reading. I saw elements of Dasein and even the radical subject notion in here that we can kind of explore. But I can give maybe a general rundown of the fourth arcanum here, the Emperor. So the first three are the magician, the Empress, the high priestess, and the fourth is the Emperor here. And we'll get into, he talks about how this is the structure of the apocalypse of St. John. It's found in these first four arcanum, which I found interesting and fascinating. But the general question being meditated on here is the source and the nature of authority. And he roots the nature of authority in the divine name, our Father who art in heaven, right? So authority is rooted in the divine name, and from that we derive the law, right? And there is this element of this fourfold emptiness that he brings in, which is the source of law and order as well. Yeah. And he talks about the different methods of crucifying the intellect, renouncing opinion, word, and movement. And all of these things are encapsulated in the symbolism of the Emperor who's leaning on his throne with his scepter, holding his belt with his left hand and holding the scepter with the right hand. So much symbolism packed in just this image. He talks about the mystery of the withdrawal, which again, of course, this brought up notions of Heidegger as well, right? This withdrawal, this abandoning of being by being, right? This withdrawal. And Tomberg says here that it's this withdrawal that situates human freedom. It's God created the void by withdrawing, and out of this void is where our human freedom is situated.
Not just human freedom, actually, but freedom of anything that exists, because he actually links freedom to existence.
Yeah, which
itself.
The quote, he says, freedom is the spiritual existence of beings. That's the quote,
period.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
So it's the Kantian thing in itself. I don't know if he said that in there, but he does bring in Kant. So the thing in itself is this freedom, this radical freedom. And he also says that real death is the absolute deprivation of liberty. That's what death is, which is interesting. He also says love, existence, and you've chosen heaven. So it's all this choice. Freedom begats a choice that we have, right? Love, existence, and you're in heaven. Hate, existence, and you're in hell. And then he goes on to going into the deep elements of the symbols. He says the Almighty, and he says the Emperor is the Almighty and the powerless all at once. And I think that's where maybe we can explore how that apply that to the political reality that we see ourselves in, what we can garner from that in thinking about political leadership in this time of things being revealed.
That's really great, James. Thank you. I would say the number one thing that is my immediate my immediate takeaway is the thing that would be important to say to our age is that Tomberg is very clear that the authority that the emperor represents is non-coercive. And I think that's what our age needs to hear more than anything, because I see nothing but attempts to coerce
everywhere.
Which is the move of power, which lacks true authority, right? This move toward compulsion and coercion is what happens when true authority is absent.
I have a question because like we had in Canada, we had the truckers convoy, right? But it was an entirely peaceful movement. So there's absolutely no coercion at all. And I wonder how peaceful movements fall into, like, where do they fall? Do you think that they're in the right place? Because I think it was Bulgakov talks a lot about revolution, right? And how revolution.
I think that kind of moral thing is like it's more falls into the realm of teaching, I think, and setting a more moral example, which is I think aligns with what Bulgakov's vision of like how the church should be related to politics, because Bulgakov's idea is in the enchurchment, right? So his vision is like he has a completely like Sophianic vision. It's like the church is the cosmos. Eventually, the church will take over everything, but like Tomberg, he doesn't believe that the church should go about this in a coercive way. Right. And he's like, there's no turning back the clock for him. There's no turning back the clock of history. That like imperial Christendom, ended for a reason, and that new gateways and new pathways have been opened up for the church. And that this path, and I think that's right, because as you can see in Tomberg's text here too, it's like, yes, the emperor represented the Christian emperor in that time, but when Tomberg talks about this, Tomberg is not calling for a return of the emperor. He says the emperor is hidden in the catacombs. He says Napoleon and Hitler erred in thinking that they could by the sword bring back the force of the emperor to guide Europe. He's like, this is a mistake. So the emperor is hidden in the catacombs, and the emperor then becomes a symbol for the initiate, for the one who knows the mystery. Like that is the one who actually is able to operate with the authority of the emperor. And then ultimately, because he ties it to the Davidic throne and he calls it a post, and the emperor is actually guarding the throne, it's very clear from his text, although he doesn't say it explicitly, but it's very highly implied that he's saying that the emperor is Christ.
Yeah, definitely. And he says that the emperor, is gone, but there's a void left. There's like an active void. It's like the specter of the emperor is there and attempting to take hold of power and take on the name of the emperor, right? It's like taking on the name of the father and making it about the identity of the emperor, right? And it causes this dissolution. It causes this destruction that we've seen in the 20th century. So it's like the specter of the emperor or the absence of the presence of the absence of Christ is always here.
Well, he says like that.
But that should only be felt in the world, though, and not the church. Which is why I think Bulgakov's idea of enchurchment is the right idea, because within the church, if we're experiencing the absence of the emperor within the church, then there's something that's gone desperately wrong, because Christ should be present for us.
Which is the case in a lot of churches now. Like
correct, it's definitely the case, and that's a problem. So.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of the secularization, because the churches have allowed, this is what the churches can't do, is we can't, just because I'm against the church being involved in partisan politics. And I think Saint Sophronia and Bulgakov both would clearly be against that too, and I think Tomberg as well. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge role for the church to play in the culture. And that is, I think that proper role is like this Bulgakov's idea of enchurchment. It's like it needs to be a power to transform the world to make it more like the church, because the church is supposed to be Catholic.
Or a place.
This is why there's no room.
Place?
That's why there's no room for me for something like Christian nationalism, because nationalism is clearly an error, because the church is Catholic. So that doesn't mean that you can't have like, your idiosyncratic ethnic expressions and cultural expressions. There's nothing, you don't see. in the kind of Catholic vision that the church is, none of those things go away, right? So when Paul says that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, he doesn't mean that like that any of the accidental properties and flavors that make those things what they are going away. He's saying that there's a fundamental unity and Catholicity that transcends those things, that binds them together.
So Nate, that the idea of no, I can't remember the order, but the no Gentile, no Jew, no, right? That St. Paul says.
Right.
That reminds me of Heidegger's clearing, right? And in the chapter on page 87, he says, now the emperor on the fourth card is alone, without a court or retinue. His throne is in no way to be found in a room of the imperial palace, but rather in the open. In the open, in an uncultivated field, not located in a town. A meager clump of grass by his foot is there as the whole imperial court, as all the witnesses of his imperial splendor. But the clear sky is spread above him. He is a silhouette on the background of the sky, alone in the presence of the sky. This is how the emperor is. And so this gives me the sense that this is about space, right? So like when you talk about the church, it seems to me that it needs to be kind of like a generator of transformation, like a space, right? That people can move through and be born into the world through, right? Like a womb, but transformed. Right. So it has to remain completely neutral in that sense. Like it's not transforming you into a Democrat or a Republican, just to keep it simple.
Right.
It's transforming you as a
it should be, in fact, being. it should be pissing off Democrats and Republicans all the time. It really should.
Yeah, but it's giving you actual existence. Like he talked about the void and the spark of God, right? Being in you, both.
Yeah.
And so it's to me, it's like it's igniting that spark of God, right? So that you're not succumbing to the void, something like that.
No, that's good.
Yeah,
that's
I actually
also
wrote that. I wrote that down exactly, or drew a little diagram here of the emperor. He stands in the clearing between the sky and the earth, right?
Yeah.
So what's missing here in the fourfold, in Heidegger's fourfold, are the mortals and the divinities, right? Because the mortals and the divinities are the ones that will take the name and authority upon themselves. So it's the few that will stand in the clearing. And Dasein, a good definition of Dasein is the ground of the clearing for the self-concealing, right? A ground for the clearing, standing in the Lichtung, for the self-concealing. And the whole idea of the emperor is to efface the self, right?
That's right.
Is the self-concealing an ego death?
It's something like the anonymous, like they talk about the emperor is to ultimately be without opinion, without word, without movement, and then ultimately without name, right?
Yes.
So I think that's what made me think of this self-concealing kind of aspect to it. But I think I want to touch a bit on, we hear the word transformation a lot from, the radical left groups, right? The whole idea of is not to philosophize about the world, is to transform the world. And that the transformation is happening through this dialectical process, this Hegelian dialectical process. So there's these two competing notions of transformation. I think the idea is transformation in the apocalypse is inevitable. Transformation is what's happening. It's the question is, what are we transforming into? And you have the option of the choice, because of freedom, to transform by engaging with the void or with engaging with Christ, right? Both are there and are available, but in our culture, in our popular culture, it's almost completely geared towards this transformation of the human into transhuman, whatever it may be. That's why there's this ambiguity between the sexes and genders, and all of this is a positive quality to this mindset of transformation. So it's interesting that there's these two competing, notions of transformation. Are you going to transform into the body of Christ or into
Well, it
A
mirrors
question
the
mark.
kind of it mirrors the kind of arbitrary transformation of pagan magic too, though, right? Because it's like you can literally transform into anything, and there are no limits on that which you can transform into. Whereas from a Christian standpoint, when we're talking about transformation, we're talking about something that's a more natural process of transformation that is the actuation of a potency that exists within us already, right? So it's more like what happens to the caterpillar when it transforms into a butterfly, than it is that sort of kind of arbitrary, turning of a prince into a toad.
Well, it's interesting
Right?
because
Yeah, go ahead, Sherry.
the like he says, if you embrace existence, that's heaven, and if you reject it, that's hell, right? And so it seems to me that you could also interchange the words void and the spark of God. So if you embrace the void, you're in hell. If you embrace the spark of God, you're in heaven, right? And the more you embrace the void, the bigger the void becomes.
It's an abyss. It's bottomless.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking about Nietzsche, right?
It's bottomless if you try to fill it with anything other than God.
Yeah. And
so
I mean,
the space
void
exists. The space exists so that God can enter in, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that communion is possible in the cosmos. That's why this is the purpose for the spaces, is for God to fill them.
Right.
But God is a lover, and he doesn't want to enter into anything forcefully, because his nature is love. So that space is there to create the possibility for that love and communion.
Right.
But if we try to fill it with anything else, and we're focused on the space, right? That's what we're looking at. We're looking at the space, and we're trying to fill. Well, we know that we have this empty space. I'm just going to fill it with whatever I can. I'm just going to consume and consume and consume, and fill this void with whatever I can fill it with. And
I actually think that the void consumes you. That you don't consume from the void. Like it grows so large that it's like a black hole. It just sucks you up. Right. Like that's
Ultimately,
the hunger that you have that you
point.
don't realize is a hunger that is a hunger for God, just expands as the more and more you engage with the void, because the more you're creating a deeper need for the only thing that can actually fill it.
Yeah, and that's why that psychoanalysis, which engages with the void at the center of human subjectivity, ultimately leads to the disintegration of identity as such.
Yes, exactly. That's
this good intention to to find and engage with the void or the abyss or whatever it is that situates our human subjectivity. It eventually will just gobble up all names, all identities, and then it becomes this whole sea of confusion. And he mentions here this idea of he brings in this the Soviet. He says this is the other reaction. This reaction of I think engaging with the void. And he says that the Soviets said when the revolution was happening, the socialist revolution, he's like, where's your God? If your God loved you so much, why isn't he here? Just make himself present, just make himself known a little bit, and then that would save you. But there's nothing. There's a silence from your God. So ultimately, what's right is this revolution of this socialist revolution, which is ultimately rooted in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wanted to make us all savages living in cities. So it's a kind of perverse inversion of Christianity is socialism and communism. It's Christianity without Christ, and it's this it's really tearing with a negative.
Yeah, I shared with you the I think it was part one. Like Bulgakov wrote this 2-part essay about the soul of socialism. That's one of the things I shared with you. That really aligns almost exactly with what Bulgakov says about it. In fact, he says essentially that socialism becomes a religion of econism. Like economy becomes like the religion.
And that's the harlot, as opposed to
it's the fact that it has these eschatological aspirations is what causes it to go wrong.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that we can see an alignment with certain principles within socialism that are clearly Christian principles, like the idea
There's a quote from Bulgakov here. He says, in the idea of revolution, what finds expression first of all is a striving towards the future, a thirst for it and a faith in it, amor futuri. In it, there is contained a certain ideal for the future, and most importantly, a certain vision, a projection of this future from the place of the present. Then another one is, utopia is always a fairy tale, a tale about the future. Since from the present it is impossible to see the future, but it is always a prophecy, also a prophecy about the future. For this future is already contained and anticipated in the present. I thought that was kind of interesting because like there has to be a way to actually strive towards the future, but right?
Yeah, Bulgakov actually acknowledges that in other places. It's interesting. He both warns against these kind of like the sort of like materialist chiliasm of socialism and other utopian movements, and he said, but at the same time he recognizes that there's a certain way in which Christians also cannot cease to work toward trying to bring about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So he does actually, which is not typical for Orthodox, because he does see that there is some actual like pre-end of all things reality to that 1,000-year reign of Christ. So he does think that like he acknowledges the dangers in it, but he says that we have to work toward it nonetheless, with a conscious awareness of these dangers. So he would actually acknowledge what you're saying there. It's like, we can't, if we're not trying to, our work is the work of the kingdom. If we're not trying to advance the kingdom, then what are we doing? Like, that's like,
no, we're doing nothing. So the word
right,
utopia
exactly.
means land of nothing, or the space of nothing. The root of utopia is, so the void is situated in the very word itself. So this utopian notion is kind of, is hoping for the void, where the kingdom is a positive quality. It's a return, it's a remembering towards something, the God of love, right? Where the open future can be anything, right? You can download your consciousness into digitally into machines, and you can attain immortality that way. Like, so, eat from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and you shall become like gods. And ultimately, that's what the notion of the transhumanist notion is, right? For the very few, obviously, because we need to get rid of the population, most of the population, in order to make this space for this infrastructure to digitally install our subjectivity into machines.
Why do you think that so many Christians so easily buy into this myth of scarcity? Is like, even though
because they're in the having mode.
Like you worship a God who fed 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes. Like, why do you think that the scarcity that the world presents to you is real?
Well, this is what I've been thinking about in light of all of this, because Jess and I are doing the book of Job, right? And at the end of the wisdom poem, Job 28, it says that the fear of the Lord is wisdom, and departing from evil is understanding. And that is a being mode, right? And it's not a having mode. So if you believe that there's scarcity in the world, then you are primarily operating in a having mode, and you're not being, to steal from Heidegger, in the world, right? You're not being in the world. And like Bulgakov says here, he says, the kingdom of God is summoned into the world, but the kingdom itself is not of this world. First of all, it is within us, but also among us. And that is being, right? And then Tomberg says you have to embrace existence in order to be in heaven, right? Well, I mean, simply put, you have to live.
Yeah, Bulgakov also points out
existence.
that
You have to love it. Yeah, you have to live.
He says in the bottom of the first paragraph on page 85, he makes the connection of the inextricable link between the void and plenitude. So he says whether you see scarcity or whether you see plenitude, both of those are inside of us, within us, right? It's what we choose to see in the world. And it's interesting, you see that the majority of the people that you see in culture talk about the overpopulation of the earth, and we're depleting its resources. But then you have people like Peter Thiel and even Elon Musk who say, no, we have a population, we have too little population. And he talks about how there's all these open spaces. We think of the population of the world and that's situated in these cities that are overcrowded. But there's tons of open space. And I think we got to be careful into, seeing what their intentions are, or kind of where they're coming from. But there's this idea of, it's really a corrosive idea to think, like the Bill Maher idea, is that his big thing is this overpopulation and we got to do something to save the earth and whatnot. It's so inverted ultimately, because human beings are looked at as the virus, as a cancer that is destroying the resources on the earth, and we need to get rid of the virus, right? And global warming is a fever that is trying to eliminate the virus from the earth. And that's if you look at the dispensation of human beings as dominators on this earth. But ultimately, we're supposed to be guardians and shepherds. And I think that's another quality of the emperor that he talks about here in another tie into Heidegger. Heidegger says human beings, Dasein is the shepherd and the guardian of being, right? So that is the emperor through and through, because the emperor is there, leaning, right, holding his belt, holding his passions, and then holding a scepter with the earth and a cross, right? So everything is rooted again to the divine name. If you get rid of the divine name, you have a void. And I could just think of a vacuum just sucking things up. People are ascending or attempting to ascend into the vacuum rather than the void, right? And it's causing chaos, but it feels from the inside. And, coming from the New Age, and I felt a lot of pulls in this book, like I did when I was reading New Age material in a couple of ways. So it gave me a little bit of pause, like an excitement, like an enthrallment of some of the stuff in there. But it depends what you're getting pulled into is not clear when you're being pulled. It feels right. It feels righteous, whatever it may be. So that's why I think it's the subtlety. It's the subtle beast, right? The most subtle of the beasts, right? This subtle pull of socialism, this subtle pull of communism. We should take care of our brothers and sisters. If somebody's hungry, we should feed them. We should redistribute wealth and make it more equitable. What's wrong with equity is making a playing field where everybody, kind of has what they need. It's so subtle and it's so attractive, but it's ultimately destructive, and it's hard to again, when you try to think about it from a cultural or kind of a grand perspective, it's kind of hard to make sense of what to do.
But at the same time, like rapacious consumer capitalism is also destructive and also serves the void just as much.
Yeah,
and I think
exactly.
And what you actually see in our age is like the bizarre coming together of both, right? You have like these kind of like weird socialist inspired like ideologies of identity existing peacefully and quite happily alongside a consumer capitalist machine that is a consumer capitalist technocratic machine that is as determined as ever to do what it does.
Well, isn't that the Luciferic and the Ahrimanic
cooperating?
Yeah, well, and they do, right? The one delivers up to the other, right? According to Steiner, like they.
Yeah, I think
serve
that's actually that is really right, Sherry, because that is right, because it's this idea of like the secret sacred self is very much that's a Luciferic kind of. That is a Luciferic thing there's a certain truth to it, right? You do have a higher self. You do have a higher identity, like
yeah, but not only that, like the Luciferic is to me, it's Steiner talks about it as the wet and the Ahrimanic as the dry, right? So you have the passions and then you have the machine, and the passions deliver you up to the machine. Capitalism and serves the passions.
Right, and the machine, that's precisely, this is why they cooperate. You hit it right there, because it opens up new avenues of desire.
Exactly.
Right? New desires that weren't even imaginable. So there's all, and what does the Ahrimanic, consumer capitalist technocratic machine, what does it want? It wants as much desire as possible So if there's if there's another cultural force that's removing any kind of limitations on desire, well, it's not going to, not only is it going to not resist it, it's going to encourage it, because that's new markets that,
Yeah.
and
Everything,
new avenues to
everything.
feed it.
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
like the harlot and the beast, right?
Exactly.
The beast uses the harlot, uses these new forms of desire
Yeah.
in our, techno-capitalist utopia that we're living in, that just hyper focuses and situates the population on these new desires,
Yeah.
right? But ultimately that the feminine aspect is absorbed and is destroyed into the machines. Ultimately, the machine just absorbs this negative aspect of the feminine as well. And then you have this total system of control, which is the
Because we know the
absolute
beast is
lack of
eventually
freedom.
turning on the harlot, right?
Yeah.
Like,
And then you have the absolute, and then so it's like the beast on a harlot is the like last bastion of negative freedom, right? You're free to follow your desires no matter what they are, right? Once what that is destroyed, then you have pure machine, then you have the complete deprivation of liberty, and that's what we're moving towards. So there's
Which is
both,
hell.
yeah, and it's
It's hell.
terrifying. It's terrifying, but it's
According to
also
Thunberg.
it's terrifying, but it's also hopeful in it, because there's a paradigm here, there's a program, it's been written, it has been written, right? But it's like, oh,
Mhm.
am I moving towards one or the other?
Right. And
Everybody
so,
thinks they're moving towards the right one, right? No matter where they're coming
Right.
from. So it's like, okay.
yeah, but then the
Careful.
Christian exists in some kind of like free floating womb, right? Not
Mm.
of the world, but in it.
Mm.
That's how I imagine it, being transformed, like this, not given up to the passions and therefore to be delivered up to the machine, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you guys think of this? And I think this is where we run into some stumbling blocks for people when we talk about, now he gets into this, gets into hermeticism here. And he talks about this hermetic idea of the synthesis of mysticism, gnosis, and magic.
Yeah.
Right. I don't like the term magic because of this. Right. So what are some synonyms? No, I mean, I think the term is problematic.
For me, magic is articulation. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Sacred magic is articulation, proper articulation of what you have reflected on, received, meditated, and reflected on, right? So you can't have gnosis without mysticism.
You can, but that's a problem. That's where we're at.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
That's the problem, I think.
Yes, you can.
I think I know what
he
you're
does
trying
say
to
that.
say
You can
is
have
that
gnosis
your
without
gnosis will
mysticism.
be your gnosis will be a delusion if you don't
Yeah.
have mysticism.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the healthy version here. So,
Mhm.
right, like without mysticism, you have no gnosis. And without both of those, you have no way of articulating anything.
Mhm.
That's how
Yeah.
that's how I see those three together.
Well, I think there's the
Yeah.
thelema, the will, right? The like kind of the magic movement, Aleister Crowley, right? Is magic is casting a spell, is imposing your will on the world in a sense. And that's this negative sense of magic.
Yeah, but Tomberg is talking about sacred magic here.
Yeah, no, I agree, but I'm telling this is the stumbling block.
Which is the alignment of the human will and the divine will.
But even scripture says that like no word returns void, right? Like your words have consequences.
Mhm.
They are spells. Like speaking is a spell.
Mhm.
It is, right?
Yeah.
It's whether or not you want to cast the right spell, if you want to put it in that terminology. And I know it's a stumbling block, but
Mhm.
This is the parable of the sower to me, right? When you articulate through mysticism and gnosis, right, and you're in alignment with God, then you are sowing seed,
Mhm.
right? Which is a casting, right?
Mhm.
The throwing of the seed. So, yeah, you better be sure before you speak.
Yeah, that's
it's grave. Speaking is grave,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it's it's the
But it's
logos.
not, it's more than just speech too, because I think like it's also like, for example, how healing would happen through that same process. So if you have someone someone who is able to be um, a conduit for a gift of healing, it's the same process. I agree with you that that speech, like particularly the kind of speech you're talking about, is the delivering of the word, I think, is the kind of speech you're talking about, or at least that's the sacred magic operation.
Well, it's also,
right?
don't you think it's also personal though?
Yes, I think that I think that there's more to being a vehicle for the delivery of the word than that is beyond just like the priest delivering a homily or the
Oh
the
yeah.
pastor
Oh,
delivering
totally.
a sermon. Like
It's all of you.
everyone has the potential to deliver the word
A sermon. Yeah.
by allowing themselves to be a vehicle, or by allowing themselves to be used by the Spirit. Which comes
Depends on the
back
spirit,
again,
right?
this idea of space that you're talking about is important there.
Well, this is okay. Let me say it like this then. If you have been mystically approaching the world, right? Like the magician, where you hold everything on your fingertips and work becomes play, and you have concentration without effort, and then you experience what I would call metanoia, gnosis, right? So an actual transformation of your consciousness. And then you articulate that out. That's going to be found in, it's not just in the delivery of the word, right? It's all of your speech. And it comes from a place of authenticity, right? Because it's personal. And, like going through Job, one of the things that's interesting about Job is that at the core of Job is authenticity and integrity. And I think that if you follow those three, mysticism, gnosis, and sacred magic, and you're aligned to God, then you are speaking from a place of integrity and authenticity, right? Which like that just emanates out. That emanates
with authority. And with
well,
authority,
that authority
that's
is,
why the
yeah.
emperor is the culmination of those things.
Right, but,
So, for example,
he has no name.
Right.
He has no name, so that authority is not his.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Which is the difference between sacred magic as which is what Tomberg is talking about, and like, say, a pagan magic, or not. I don't know what I'd say, because this wouldn't be fair to classify all pagan magic. What word do I want to use? Let's say sorcery. Let's use the term sorcery. This is Charles Williams actually uses that distinction between sorcery and magic. Sorcery is that which tries to use the same, like the principles that we were just talking about, but instead of trying to use them in order to in order to help implement the divine will, it tries to enforce the will of the person who is using those forces. So it's like their own will that they're seeking to do. I would say that would be, talking about it from the terms of speech, we have sorcery as sorcery is at a very high art right now. In our culture. We call it advertising.
I just got this book.
The
one that Michael Martin.
Right.
That's what it's about. Eros and magic in the Renaissance. It's about sorcery, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I haven't read it yet, but it's going to be good.
And it's in other parts in the book. He talks about this, the negative orientation of electricity, right? And McLuhan talks about the prince of this world is an engineer, is an electrical engineer. He says that in quotes. So we're living within, in the midst of this, mass advertising, mass, digital culture, which is this double-edged sword. But let me read this section here that really breaks down the first three arcanum and situates it into the fourth. I think that
sure, go for it. Yeah, that's a great section.
It says, all right, so it says, it is the state of concentration without effort taught by the first arcanum, followed by, and this is, I think, the path to obtaining the coherence between mysticism, Gnosticism, and sacred magic, right? He gives you kind of the path. You got to go through the first three arcanum. If you kind of try to skip those, you missed, I think, a certain quality. So he says, it is a state of a concentration without effort taught by the first arcanum, followed by a vigilant inner imagination and thought, where the conscious self acts together with super creative activity and contemplates in letting pass in review everything which preceded, with a view to summarizing, I think I skipped a little bit, summarizing practical teaching of the fourth arcanum. The mastery of these four psychurgical operations, symbolized by the magician, the high priestess, the empress, and the emperor, is the key to the apocalypse, one will search in vain for another. So the key to the apocalypse, to the revelation, is these four arcanum, which I found fascinating. And it's this fourfold as well. And I'm not familiar with each arcanum to try to parse out the relationship between the four and make a lot of meaning out of that. But I have enough where it's something that is interesting,
Right. Well, again, it has to do with let's see if I can, it has to do with this idea of the emperor symbolizing the initiate. It's so it's the one, essentially the emperor is the one who has eyes to see. And the reason it's tied to the apocalypse of John like that is that if you are able to implement those principles and those practices, then you are one who can see the kingdom now, which is why I think also that the emperor he's in the open field, right? And rather than in an imperial palace, because that also relates to this mystery of the kingdom that is, it's if you're looking for it, if you're looking for the kingdom in a particular place, you're not going to find it. But if you're able to, if you're one who can see and you walk out into the open field,
clearing,
then it's everywhere.
That's what I was just going to say.
It's everywhere and nowhere. That's the nature of the kingdom.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that's part of why what he's saying here actually relates back to this idea of why he's in an open field. Once you realize that the emperor also represents not just the figure of the historical Christian emperor, but also the Christian initiate.
Yes, that's good, Nate.
Yeah, and I wrote notes here. So one is concentration without effort, the magician, right? 2 is vigilant inner silence, high priestess. 3, imagination plus thought, and then conscious plus super conscious, the empress. And then 4, halts creative activity and contemplates. That's the emperor, right? So it's those are the 4 qualities that kind of inaugurate the initiate into the revelation of the apocalypse, in a sense.
What I like about the Empress card is that water is present in the card, and water is a place of reflection, right? Where you look in to, and it reflects back. So all of this mystical experience that you're having, right? This concentration without effort, to me, that is just simply, you don't have to go to a yoga retreat in order to concentrate. You can go for a walk and concentrate, right? That's to me, concentration without effort. And then the stillness comes in the Empress card, where you sit and reflect on the water, right? And you look at everything that you have taken in. And then it speaks back to you. And the reason this resonates with me because of George MacDonald, and he says that nature is man turned inside out, right? And it is the wardrobe with which he clothes his thoughts. So if you're not taking in creation, you actually can't form a thought, right? Because what it does is it reflects you back to you. And then back, it's like this reciprocal thing, right? Like you and nature. or you and your environment or whatever. So, and then when you have that experience, suddenly you can, without the gnosis part, like I'm just speaking from my own experience. So I thought this mystical thing going on for the longest time, and I didn't have the gnosis, and I couldn't articulate anything. I seriously could not. I just was gobbledygook. I'm trying to tell people what's going on in my head, and it's not making any sense. I needed the gnosis. I needed to be able to reflect and have it reflect itself back to me. And then I could articulate, right? And I thought I didn't know there was a step in between. So I thought all I had to do is learn how to, I needed vocabulary. Like I was getting really pragmatic about it, right? But no, I actually had to go through that reflective period, right? Where it starts to speak. And that's Sophia. That to me is the role of Sophia, right?
So I think that's right. And I think that's important. That this fourth step is key, right? Because the idea of reflecting in a mirror or in water is the idea of narcissus, right? Is perpetually
That's
always
the danger.
looking at
That's the danger that comes with it.
Exactly. So if you don't have the fourth step, which is halts creative activity and contemplates. So
Yeah.
that allows, I think, that fourth step, because I think if you have the first three steps without the fourth step, you have black magic, or you have, inverted magic, because you can have psychopaths that are in whether they're gurus or CEOs of companies that can concentrate without effort, that have a sense of vigilance and inner silence, and that have connected their conscious with some sort of superconscious. But if it's all rooted in their identity, right? If they don't get out of the way, like the fourth step, step tells us to, that's where we run into the world that we're in now, I think.
Right.
Because most of the people that run the world are media companies, are multinational corporations, almost across the board, do not believe in God, do not think there's a higher power. They're not doing that fourth step. They're just doing the first three steps, and we're seeing what that's doing. We're seeing the fruits of that, and it's still, people still can't, it's still hard to reflect on why that's happening and what that means.
Well, it's like they only operate on this horizontal level, right? They don't have the vertical axis. And what's interesting about that comes to my mind, Nate, is Emil Boek talks about the intensification of time, in the apocalypse, how it's not, the end is not nearer, but time is more compressed.
Right.
Right. And it would make sense because the vertical axis gives you this open sky that the emperor has over his head, right? And if you don't have that, then you're pressed down and pushed along, right? This timeline, which would give you this sense of intensity and compression, right? Like
and scarcity.
Well, and scarcity, but it gives you the feeling like the end is coming, right? Because you're hemmed in on all sides, kind of thing. But and I think that's what happens when you have everybody operating on this horizontal plane only, and they don't have that vertical axis, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's like we're gazed on. So I think the important distinction between quantity and quality when we're talking about something like eternity or apocalypse, right? Eternity is not something like infinite clock time, right? It's not something quantitative.
Right.
Eternity is an intensity that's present and it's available in a sense. I think it's intensity is an important, I think, term there. I think the horizontal plane is necessary and not sufficient, because the horizontal plane is the plane of counting, of quantity.
Right.
Right. There's no qualitative plane there.
Right.
But the vertical axis is still there. So you have vertical access to the vertical, but you don't have vertical access. You don't have a pillar that's rooting you to the vertical. So you're engaging with hyperdimensional beings, whatever it may be, but you don't have an axis there. There's no and then it just becomes chaos on the horizontal plane. So I love the idea of the cross reflecting that as well, that you have the material and the spiritual meeting together. Christ is the mediator of both. It's such a beautiful and kind of coherent way to think of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not in this chapter, but like, I can't help but think of what Tom Berg says about the serpent and evolution in the horizontal plane.
Mhm.
Like in that, and this is why I brought the idea of scarcity back into it, because as long as you're focused on the horizontal, then the principle of struggle for existence and the evolutionary principle of the serpent is all that's going to apply. As long as as long as your vision is only along the horizontal, that is all there is, and it is a fact on that
Oh, isn't that
horizontal
interesting
plane.
though, Nate? Like you think about the Israelites having to look at the serpent on the cross, on
Yeah,
this.
he actually points that out. Yeah,
Yeah,
It says
like they
crucify the
actually have to
serpent.
look up
Yeah.
right.
to understand
So-
that serpent. Yeah.
And then
Interesting.
Tom Berg also suggests that once you bring in the vertical, then you also see there's this other principle, which he says that plant life shows us very clearly, which is the cooperation for existence.
Mhm.
So the scarcity mentality is tied to the struggle for existence horizontal view. Once you bring in this principle of cooperation for existence that you have when you bring in the cross, right, where you have like both the horizontal and the vertical operating together, and you have this cooperation for existence principle, all of a sudden it opens everything up. There can be no scarcity anymore because you're a child of God.
Mhm.
I mean,
He actually says,
So-
crucify the serpent. That's like crucify the intellect in a sense, right? Crucify the serpent,
Yeah.
put a pin in them, right? And bring them up vertically.
he gets
Mhm.
the chapter
Heals.
he gets a the crucifixion of the intellect becomes a very large theme in the letter that we're going to be doing our next discussion on, which is letter 10, the Wheel of Fortune. That's definitely an aspect of what he's talking about.
Yeah, I'm actually at two. What is the gentleman's name that has done the audiobook version? I think it's Daniel Town.
Daniel Townsend.
God
Yeah.
bless him, man. I've
Yeah.
been able to get. I'm like
I know, me too.
Yeah.
I
15,
actually
yeah.
told him
Yeah.
that.
I
I
we're
did
going to be
too.
having a conversation soon. I just got to get it. I'm still settling in after the movie. I
Oh,
gotta
I'm
get it.
glad to hear
But,
that.
yeah, but Daniel and I talked about having a conversation. So
Yeah, I'm
get
on
Daniel
Temperance, but it's so hard to listen to it. There's so much there, and
yeah, you really need
I
to
don't-
read it. It's
Yeah,
an
for sure.
incredibly dense book.
yeah.
I
Have you
read
gotten to
it and
the
listen.
chapter of force?
I
yet?
sent one of the chapters to Vervaeke. I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm
what'd he say?
like, don't let, I'm like, John, I said, do not let the title fool you. This is probably the greatest wisdom text of the 20th century. Just read it. Just read this chapter.
Have you gotten to the force letter 11? Force.
No, we've been
man.
going through as a group, and that's the next one we're reading.
Yeah, can I read a little bit from it?
Go for it. Yeah.
Mhm.
He talks about Tom Berg talks about his very real encounter with the Theotokos, and it's just beautiful. I'll see if I can find where I'll just see if this works here. He says, there is not a shadow of doubt for anyone who takes the spiritual life of mankind seriously, even if he is short of authentic spiritual experience, that the Blessed Virgin is not an ideal only, nor a mental image only, nor an archetype of the unconscious of depth psychology, nor lastly an occultist egregore, a collective astral creation of believers, but rather a concrete and living individuality like you and I, who loves, suffers, and rejoices. It is not only the children of Fatima, the child of Bernadette, and he brings on all these names, who have witnessed the lady, but also innumerable adults across the centuries, including our own. Numerous meetings still remain intimate and undivulged. I know of 3 series of such meetings, including one in Tokyo, Japan, but one series of meetings with the Blessed Virgin took place recently in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where the Blessed Virgin manifested herself as the Lady of all nations and inaugurated a prayer movement with a special prayer with a view to saving all nations from degeneration, disaster, and war. I may add that I went to Amsterdam in order to make a scrupulous investigation as possible, and the result of this investigation there, confirmed subsequently by experiences of a personal nature, was complete certainty, not only with respect to the authenticity of the experiences of the seer, a woman of 40 years of age, but also with respect to the authenticity of the subject of these experiences. Well, last section here, he says, one meets the Blessed Virgin inevitably when one this is my favorite part in this chapter. He says, one meets the Blessed Virgin inevitably when one attains a certain intensity of spiritual aspiration, when this aspiration is authentic and pure. The very fact of having attained a spiritual sphere which comprises a certain degree of intensity and purity of intention puts you in the presence of the Blessed Virgin. This meeting belongs to a certain quote unquote sphere, to a certain degree of intensity and purity of spiritual aspiration, of spiritual experience, just as the experience of having a mother belongs naturally to the human family life on earth. It is therefore as natural for the spiritual domain as the fact of having a mother is natural in the domain of one's terrestrial family. The difference is that on earth, one can certainly be motherless, whilst in the realm of the spiritual, this can never happen. And he goes on and on.
Yeah,
I think it's just
that's great.
Amazing.
I was just reading a section from
I'm gonna have to go.
Oh, okay.
But I'll see you later, Nate.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's all right. We can
Sorry about that, but
we can
I
do
only
another
had-
one of these soon. I understand, Sherry.
Yep. We'll see you later.
Yep.
Nice
Take
talking
care.
See you,
with you.
James. Yeah.
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 Good to
Bye-bye.
see you.
Bye,
Bye.
Sherry. No, that's really great. I was just reading a little bit of yesterday of Bulgakov's essay on hypostasis and hypostaticity, and there was a section where he was kind of echoing. I don't have the text with me right now, so I can't share the text, but something that he was saying there, like he was very much focused on like how like where the work of the Mother of God and Christ like come together within the soul. Like you really do need like there's a role for both. And it reminded me of something I said to John Vervaeke in an email once, where I was talking about the fact that we actually need to imitate both the Mother of God and Christ as Christians, because, and this ties to what Sherry was talking about earlier about this creation of space, because like it is the womb of the Mother of God which creates the space for Christ to be born. And that's not only for Christ to be born into the earth and to incarnate into the cosmos, but it's also necessary, like it's also a spiritual necessity for that to happen within you. Mm-hmm. So in order for you to be able to talk about Christ in you, you also have to have beforehand imitated his mother in creating that space within you for that to be born within your soul.
Yeah. So the term, so the mother represents matter, right? The term matter means mother, right? They're the same root, right?
Yeah, mater. Yeah.
So I think it's appropriately situating matter. The Virgin does this, right? As opposed to the harlot. He juxtaposes the harlot and the Virgin a lot. And I think in that chapter there, he talks about the difference between, and he really harks on what virgin means.
Which
right?
is why that she's associated
virginity.
with the church, right? This is why, and you can see this because it is ultimately what you're talking about is it's the symbol of the union of heaven and earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I don't know if we talked about Dugin's reflection on the Dormition of the Theotokos, where it's the only icon where you have Christ as an adult, and you have the Dormition of the Holy Mother of God. So it's like when the diminution or the matter recedes, the Mother of God reposes, and then you have the coming of Christ. So you have this the more emphasis on the spiritual or the heavenly. But the material doesn't go away. It's still there and important in a sense. So it's an interesting icon. So all icons usually have obviously the Mother of God and Christ child together. This is the only icon where you have Christ as an adult and the mother. And I think he has her in his hands, the baby. If you know what I'm talking about, which icon?
Yeah, I do. And I actually saw and you talked to Peugeot about that, right? And I saw that conversation. Yeah, that was really good.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and I wonder. I don't want to sidetrack us too much, but do you have any thoughts about like, what are your thoughts about like your immediate thoughts about what the difference would be between, let's say, the Orthodox dogma of Dormition versus the Catholic idea of Assumption?
Well, tell me a little bit about the Catholic idea of Assumption.
Well,
what do you?
for Catholics, Mary is just bodily assumed into heaven.
Mhm. So like
So
Elijah.
how would Dormition differ from the idea of assumption?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. But I think that there's something to be, and there's something to be said there. And I'm not trying to say, I don't want to have a theological debate about which is right or anything like that. I think just I think there's something fruitful probably from taking a look at the two side by side to see what the meaning of each is and what the contrast between those suggests. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
you
I'll
had
have to
any
think about
immediate
that.
thoughts, I was just curious.
Yeah, I'll have to think about it because I'm not really sure the distinction. I'm not well versed enough in the distinction between assumption and dormition to think through it, but it seems like an interesting thing to consider. But yeah, I think the central thing is the importance of the Blessed Virgin in life in general. I think that's an answer. It's the solution, and it's the it's the ark in the apocalypse, right? It's the Blessed Virgin. She is the solution to the gender situation that we find ourselves in. And this, like, we don't know what a woman is. What is a woman? Like, and I can understand, I can take it from the postmodern perspective to say that, a woman is like an open question. It's not a definite thing. It's this thing, I can kind of, sympathize with the position there, but not really ultimately. So we've gone confused, and this main confusion is this the effacement of the feminine because of this, because of hyperfemininity. It's like the feminist movement effaced the feminine ultimately.
I wouldn't
really
say it's a
strange.
hyperfemininity though. This is where I would disagree. This is where,
Yeah.
and I know that's a common analysis, but I actually think what we have
Hypermasculinity.
is a hypermasculinity. Exactly.
It's a yin and yang thing.
It's actually, it seems like the move is to turn everything into the masculine, while at the same time, and to make the masculine accessible to everyone by denigrating the particularity of the masculine.
Yeah, I think it's
really weird.
I think their poles are they're connected, the masculine and the feminine, right? So
right.
If you go towards hyper femininity, or if you go too far, boom, it flips into masculinity, and it happens
right.
like subconsciously, where it's not like we're allowing, men transitioning into play women's sports, which destroys women's sports. We're allowing men who've transitioned into women to go into women's prisons, causing all these issues, and it's something so obvious that's wrong, right? This idea of weaponized compassion. Oh, this person has gender dysphoria, we need to be compassionate. Sure, I'll give you that, but this is wrong, like objectively, and it's by all of the stupid smart people are, the scientists, the doctors, all of these people that we're supposed to rely on for our, for the function of our society are allowing this to happen. It's like really the yin yang flip is really, I think, a great analogy here. And Jonathan talks about the flip a lot, right?
Yeah,
so
he does.
Ultimately, I guess we could maybe touch on one more thing here before I got to roll.
Yeah.
I brought in this idea, came to me. I lost my spot now, but he talks about Thunberg talks about the synthesis of the idealist and the realist, like the philosopher synthesizes, but doesn't synthesize the ideal in the real. Like Dugan talked about, we need to get to radical subjectivity, is not to have these two categories and have the second category, the real, manifest the ideal, right? It's not about the coherence between the two. It's something more originary, more primordial, more fundamental. And I think that Thunberg kind of brings that up here in terms of the Hermetic idea of, the culmination or the root of the realist, idealist.
Well, in letter 9, he talks about that in at length.
Yeah, I think I have that underlined here somewhere, but I think that's an open question of what that would look like practically.
Yeah, I think what he says in letter 9 is that we need to be realist idealist or idealist realist, right?
Yeah.
So for Thunberg, it's like it's a polarity that should be respected as a polarity, and that the attempt to reduce it to one or the other is the problem, and that the Christian path is to hold both polarities together.
Yeah, in through the thou, right? And I think that's where the
Right.
Trinity comes in, because I think you can take that concept of real idealist and synthesizing it and say, okay, so men and women don't really exist. They're not essential functions. So why not, you can't say what's a woman? A woman is a human, feminine, female, whatever it may be. Because if you're a realist idealist, you can just mix them and it's not a big deal. If you don't have that
Right.
third, Trinity to kind of ground it into,
Well,
into
there's
thou.
postmodernism makes a too big of a deal of our inability to lexically fix things. And because essentially what it's doing is pointing out the limitations of left brain rationalism at the end of the day, right? And as Christians, we can embrace that. Like we realize that we have to crucify the intellect, that there are limitations, there are certain things but that doesn't mean that there's no capacity within human beings to know what something is, even if they can't give you a lexically precise, absolute understanding. Like, so everyone knows what a woman is, right? We know that through intuition. We don't know that through rational processes at all. Our understanding of what a woman comes through intuition. And so we pretend nobody knows something that everyone knows, because we have lost the concept of intellectual intuition entirely from the dialogue, because we don't understand what first principles are anymore.
Yeah, because we've deconstructed them to death, but we've deconstructed them using the very tools that are being criticized by using rational, discourse. We're destroying rational discourse by using rational discourse. It's like, it's not.
But we lost that Aristotelian understanding of first principles that recognized this concept that before you begin to use the reason, there are just certain principles that are grasped through intellectual intuition, which are just taken for granted. So, for example, like Descartes' entire project would have been seen as absurd to Aristotle. This idea of just radically doubting as much as you can doubt. Aristotle would be like, why? Why don't you just begin with what is obvious to everyone through intellectual intuition and then build from there? Yeah.
Go from the particular to the universal, right? And then Plato went from the universal to the particular, right? And then Descartes said, I'm going to doubt everything except myself doubting. And that's the root of the modern self is rooted right there. And the fruits have been,
in fact, Tom Bray, I believe in this chapter, or maybe in chapter, I just read letter 10 too, so maybe it's in letter 10. But there's a point in the text where he actually says that the spirit of the modern scientific age is essentially cynicism. Like he just says it's cynicism. Yep. That's what it is.
Yep, cynicism and doubt. And Florensky calls it epoche, E-P-O-C-H-E. And he says that if we try to use rationality to transcend rationality, right? There's always this inherent contradiction within rationality. Like something is either A or not A, right? And he critiques the synthesis, the dialectic, in a sense, is that it's a antinomy, right? It's an antinomy that can't be solved from the level of rationality. And he favors reason over rationality. He makes a distinction between the two. But ultimately, there are these antinomies. He brings in Kant's idea of antinomies. There are these, from the human perspective, they look like contradictions, paradoxes, and antinomies. And trying to use our human logic as it is now to understand them will always lead to, the void, right? And that's then eventually you're going to say, oh, that the center of human subjectivity is void, because look, we've tried to work out the antinomies, these contradictions. We tried to work them out, and it leads to this void. We're made up of the void.
Yeah,
so
right.
The only way to overcome it is through the tri-hypostatic union.
We're a mixture of being and becoming is another way to think about it, right?
Yep. And we're also, in the face of another, like in the face of God, or through another. So I am a reflection of you through another, right? So the Trinity is important.
Yes.
In a mystery too. So
later this month, I'm having another young theologian on my channel, JD Lionheart, and we're going to talk about his book, Monotheism, The subtitle is like an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer every question of the last 2,000 years one night in a pub.
Okay.
And so he wrote it's a theology book, but he wrote it in the form of a dramatic dialogue, and he put all the academic stuff in the footnotes. But
Okay.
his essential argument in this book is that yes, the Trinity is a contradiction, but it's exactly the same kind of contradiction that you run into when you try to explain the universe itself.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's
very
necessary. Like the Trinity is
exactly. It's a contradiction that you can't evade because
reality.
There's no other way of understanding it.
You can invert it like Hegel did, right? You can, Hegel inverted the Trinity and made the Father the ideal realm, the absolute, right? The Son, the state. He actually says the Son is the state, and the Holy Spirit is this is the process of realizing the absolute, of realizing the Father. He actually uses the Trinity through the state, which through the Holy Spirit is the process of synthesis. So the realization of the absolute is ultimately rooted in the state through the functioning of the work of people, transforming material relations into the next level. And it's a exact inversion of the Trinity, right? Because I think what's important is to really engage with the mystery of the relationship between the three persons of the Trinity. And in those relations will inform how we should be with each other, with our families.
Well, I think the relations are key, because ultimately that's the difference between the kingdom and the world, or ought to be, right? The difference ought to be in the relations.
Yep.
Like that's where it should be seen.
Yeah. And if it's done appropriately, if it's not, that can be done like Hegel. Again, he was a Christian. He was a Hermetic Christian, I'd say, right? And he inverted the Trinity as the Son is a negation of the Father, right? And through this negation, a synthesis occurs in the Holy Spirit. And in this, we are returning. It's a very Gnostic view of returning, of escaping the prison, of escaping the material existence, the slavery that we're in. It happens through the dialectical process, and that is essentially, Marx took that and ran with it, and ultimately that's why we're trying to free ourselves. That's why everything's about emancipation, or emancipating.
Yeah, that's
ourselves.
why Tomberg's chapter on the Wheel of Fortune is focused on this idea of like the world that is ruled by the prince of this world. The serpent is like it's the serpent that's swallowing its own tail that creates a wheel. And the idea is to create an open circle, which is a spiral.
Yeah. And that's so much there. Yeah, but I got to run.
It was a great conversation. Thanks for joining me this morning, James.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it too. Put it on your channel. You want to send it to me? I'll put it on later on or whatnot.
You bet.
And
we'll do.
Yeah. Till next time. Thank you.
Yep. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.